Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24, 2022. What are the possible historical and political reasons why this invasion has taken place in the 21st century? Let's find out. After the tragedy of the Second World War, people speculated, or at least hoped, that invasions and war would be a thing of the past. With the formation of the United Nations, matters of global magnitude would be sorted out with diplomacy and deliberation, right? Still, wars continue to plague us. Russia has now become the third member of the UN Security Council's permanent members to invade a sovereign country. In Libya, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, conflicts flare up time and again with no repercussions. And now, Ukraine. But this time, there will be repercussions.
And Putin must pay the price.
The US and Europe have levied draconian sanctions against Russia that they believe will cripple them in the short term as well as the long term.
Putin's aggression against Ukraine will end up costing Russia dearly, economically and strategically. We will make sure of that.
This move is supposed to deter Russia from its territorial ambitions, as the fear of economic decline often puts countries on the back foot. Despite the threat of sanctions, Russia decided to invade its independent sovereign neighbor. But why has Russia invaded Ukraine? To understand the answer to that seemingly simple question, one needs some historical context. Eastern Europe has a diverse collection of ethnic groups, all of whom made their way into the area at different times throughout its history. The Slavs, Bulgars, Mongols, Germanic tribes, Magyars, Turks, Jews, and the Roma all made Eastern Europe their home. Since Western Europe had a less diverse population, it was able to centralize quickly. Eastern Europe's constantly changing jurisdictions never clearly defined who ethnic groups were and how they differed. This made it difficult to centralize, making the region less stable than its neighbors. Overall, the nations of Western Europe, while chaotic in their own right, had a much easier time securing and retaining self-rule than Eastern Europeans. With the constantly changing borders in Eastern Europe, each country went through phases of foreign control or independence. This ebb and flow characterizes the region's experience. Since the beginning, the larger states of Eastern Europe have attempted to shore up their power by subjugating their neighbors. The empires of Europe tried to create their spheres of influence by controlling other territories physically through methods such as invasion and war, or economically through tribute or trade restrictions. Under pressure from larger empires, the peoples either resisted foreign domination or learned how to retain their autonomy while coexisting with the people who wanted to subjugate them. The history of the Russian-Ukraine relationship begins with the ancient Rus people, who arrived and settled in the region from the 8th to the 11th centuries. Their origin and identity are in dispute, but most scholars think they were Norse people who settled and ruled the areas between the Baltic and the Black Seas. They formed a polity known as the Kievan Rus, which was governed from the city of Kiev. Much later, the city would become Ukraine's capital city. The Rus had unified a substantial portion of the Eastern European land under the Byzantine Church in the 10th century. Russia and Belarus derived their name from the Rus people, and several Ukrainians also traced their ancestry to them. Known as the Mother of Rus cities, Kiev served as the capital of the Rus Empire during the medieval era. This is where a nationalist component finds its way into the discussion, since Putin claims Ukraine to be a historical part of Russia. After the Mongols invaded Kievan Rus, the Russian Empire was formed, and Ukraine was not a part of it. But after some trouble with other tribes, they sought a union with the Russian Empire, the region's major power. And so, the idea of similar ethnicity and identity has prevailed for a long time. It was not until 1918, when Ukraine declared its independence, that the rift between the two was manifested in the terms of borders. The prejudice and internal issues had been there for the last few centuries, but this was the first time in history that Ukraine emerged as an independent geographical entity. However, this period of independence did not last long. The pendulum of power in Eastern Europe had always swung back and forth, and since the formation of the Russian Empire, and even after its dissolution, Russia was the superpower in the region, very much like the United States is in North America. Therefore, the complicated relationship has never resolved in a meaningful fashion. The dissolution of the Russian Empire built and ruled over by the likes of Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, came at the expense of the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks were followers of Marxist ideology, who overthrew the monarchy, executed the royal family of Romanov, and assumed control of Russia in 1917. The RSFSR, or the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, concluded their involvement in the First World War by signing a treaty. Then, they began reaching out to newly independent states of the region, including Ukraine, for integration. The Ukrainian War of Independence continued from 1917 to 1922, at which point it was absorbed into the Soviet Union and became the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. The USSR, or the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, was an amalgamation of similar socialist states. Ukraine would remain under the shadow of Russia until the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, and even then, it would not be able to escape. But let's jump back to the World Wars for a moment. Soon after the First World War, the Second World War began. The Axis forces started strong and were considered the probable victors of the war. It was not until 1941 that things started to change. When the Second World War started, the Soviet Union was an ally of the Germans, and it signed a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany in 1939, enabling the two powers to partition Poland between them. In 1941, Hitler decided to invade the Soviet Union. German aggression towards the Soviet Union, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, cost them heavily in the coming years. The Soviets managed to push the Germans back. By 1945, the Soviets had managed to enter and occupy Germany, bringing an end to the global conflict. No country had more casualties than the Soviet Union, whose war losses amounted to over 26 million personnel and civilians. In the eyes of the Russians, they had saved Western Europe from Nazi Germany. So they felt deceived in 1949, when the Western nations decided to form NATO as a means to protect the West from the East. The Cold War cemented this mistrust as Western Europe sided with the US. Over the next few decades, this mistrust intensified on both sides of the globe as the two superpowers claimed their areas of influence. The West was wary of the East's ruthless leftist ideologies, while the East was skeptical of the Western adherence to capitalist ideas. This was when the process of Stalinization took place in Eastern Europe, as Stalin established communist regimes throughout the region. In 1961, the Eastern Bloc, which included East Germany, built the Berlin Wall. The separation of the East from the West was solidified until the Iron Curtain broke down in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Russia continued to exert and exercise some sort of authority over these states, but there was continuous pushback from the Eastern Bloc, as they wanted to unify with the rest of Europe. Generally, the call for the fall of communism came from the need and desire to become part of Western Europe again. The countries in the Eastern Bloc were tired of being cut off from the world. Part of the reason for the independence push was the decolonization movements of the 20th century. The Eastern European push was an extension of the spirit of revolution and the desire for self-rule found in other former colonies throughout the world. One by one, states in the Soviet bloc called for independence. In December 1991, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus all met. The Soviet Union fell, and what was left of the Eastern Bloc turned into several independent states. After the fall of communism, Eastern European countries, now free from the yoke of the Eastern Bloc, knew they needed to move forward. Joining NATO and the EU, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the European Union was a common goal for most Eastern European countries. Becoming part of an international community would help the countries that no longer felt secure after the fall of communism. Still, joining NATO and the EU was difficult. They had to successfully establish market economies and democracies before they were admitted. Becoming part of the EU meant that the organization could regulate its members' economies. Only 4 Eastern European countries had joined NATO by 1999: the Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, and East Germany, after it had rejoined with West Germany. In 2004, Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia joined NATO. In 2009, Albania and Croatia joined as well. In 2017, Montenegro and North Macedonia became members. Russia has watched its circle of influence recede over the last 3 decades. Russia claims that in the 1990s, right after the fall of the Soviet Union, it was verbally agreed that NATO would not expand eastward. On the other hand, the US claims there was no written agreement, which deems the Russian claims invalid. In 2014, in a bid to retain its influence in the region, Russia annexed Crimea from Ukraine. It was referred to as a warning for future tidings. But NATO's proposals in 2021 for further expansion towards the east irked Putin. Military and political experts have been warning of a potential war because of NATO's eastward expansion since the early 2010s. Some stating that NATO's eastward expansion may turn out to be the Treaty of Versailles for a Third World War. These warnings began to seem like prophecies when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. It is worth noting that the chances of a Third World War happening are slim since Ukraine is not a NATO member. It has become the boundary between NATO and Russia, not unlike the Berlin Wall during the Cold War. Putin says that by taking control of Ukraine, he is securing Russia against the encroaching Western forces. The people who side with Russia, mostly the Global South, claim that Russia is merely responding to increasing hostility from the West. They point to the invasions of Libya, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan as potent examples of the US and its allies doing the same. Even though the Middle East might side with Russia in a potential Cold War, they have condemned Russia's invasion, and some rebels from Syria, which was previously invaded by Russian forces, are moving to Ukraine to join the Ukrainian line of defense. Conversely, while the majority of the Global South condemns the invasion, they, at the same time, defend Russia's stance. They reference the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Russian weapons near U.S. soil created fear among Americans and garnered distrust toward the Russians. Putin claims that it is Europe that has been hostile towards him by bringing weapons to his front door. While some Russian citizens have come out in protest against the war, surveys show that more of them agree with Putin's actions. Over the years, they have seen their influence wane compared to other powers in the world and feel threatened by the West. With NATO right on their front door, they feel a sense of unease and tension. Russia has been a collectivist society for a long time, even before the arrival of the Bolsheviks, so for them, their neighbors' alignment with NATO is nothing short of a threat to their existence. On the other hand, the oligarchs will probably survive, but the sanctions will have a strong impact on the lives of the average Russian people. Their spending power will be reduced, and they will be cut off from many facilities that the West provides them. In turn, Europeans will be deprived of the energy imports from Russia and Ukraine, and will have to pay higher oil and gas prices. Russia has also responded with its own sanctions of its commodities that will lead to an increase of energy prices around the world. The West claims that the need for NATO arose precisely because Russia was bullying the Eastern Bloc for so long, and that the Russian invasion of Ukraine proves just that. There is also a prevalent idea that a bipolar world would not be bad, since the Russo-Sino bloc could keep the West in check, and vice versa. Some experts have pointed out that Russia might be doing this for the reasons that the US and NATO have been accused of in the past: natural resources. Ukraine has some of the largest recoverable reserves of uranium, titanium, manganese, iron, and mercury ores. They also have tons of coal and shale gas reserves. In addition to that amazing array of natural resources, it is estimated that Ukraine provides enough food for 600 million people. Some counter this narrative by claiming that Russia does not want Ukraine's flat, fertile land because it has more natural resources and food than Ukraine has. One should note the importance of Crimea for controlling the Black Sea. In 2019, the former Ukrainian energy minister, Stepan Kubev, said, "Ukraine has lost 80% of oil and gas deposits in the Black Sea and a significant part of the port infrastructure due to the annexation of Crimea." Ukraine, however, did not simply accept the annexation of Crimea in 2014. They decided to block the water flow of the North Crimean Canal and in the process cut off a channel that provided more than 80% of Crimea's water needs. Thus, Crimea's fields have been dry, and its cities forced to ration water. This is obviously not something that Russia has been happy about, since it's something that has cost them billions of dollars. On February 26, 2022, Russian troops bombed the concrete dam blocking water supply to Crimea, and have since taken control of the North Crimean Canal. So, in conclusion, to answer the question of why Russia decided to invade Ukraine, one needs to consider this climate and water conflict as well. What are your thoughts about all this? What do you think is the primary reason that Russia is invading Ukraine? Comment below.